I'm assuming you already know what The Sopranos is, so I'm just gonna jump right into its piece of shit prequel, The Many Saints of Newark. In the realm of piece of shit Sopranos media that people claim tarnishes the reputation of the series, though, I'm of course inclined to address the show's controversial ending. It's brilliant, one of the best TV endings out there. What better a way to assert the cinematic potential of TV than by using a cut, the most essential cinematic tool, to relay the last piece of information? What better a way to punctuate a show set on demystifying a sensationalized world than by depicting death, which the characters mystify and sensationalize throughout the show, as a mundane, monotonous void? I know it's widely debated, but I don't think there's any ambiguity that Tony gets popped. And it's not just the cut itself, or even the construction of the final scene, it's everything leading up to it. The Sopranos doesn't have a climactic, Breaking Bad, one last hurrah to go out on. There are numerous individual climaxes spread throughout the entire last season, but the finale is just another day in the life, as really every episode of the show is, something its more linearly narrative successors seem to have lost sight of. We tune into an episode, a season, a few seasons, and we drift into these characters' lives, which continue to go on outside of the brief windows we get to look into them. This is the very same way we tune into life, with just a small window of consciousness into a world that continues to go on outside of our brief time witnessing it. And when it's over, it's over. So it's no wonder people were clutching their TV boxes wondering if that was really it. It's not just that a show ended, it's that, vicariously, life itself had just ended. When The Many Saints of Newark ended, I also thought, is that really it? But not in quite the same way. This experience was more similar to when I watched Mockingjay Part 1 and had to ask myself as the credits rolled if I had actually just watched a full movie. I guess the only difference is that Mockingjay Part 1 wasn't a full movie. It was part 1. Sure, you could say this movie leads into The Sopranos, but David Chase obviously approached it as a self-contained movie, narratively at least. My biggest apprehension when I found out what the story was about was that Dickie Moltisanti is only ever spoken about in the show, clearly imprinting himself on Tony and Christopher, the latter of whom specifically only really has his imagination to go off of. In turn, so do we, the audience. I was worried watching him do his thing would be underwhelming, as there's no way he could live up to the idea of him illustrated in the show. But that's of course the exact kind of demystification the show set out to achieve in the first place, so I think it was pretty fitting for the movie. Dickie Moltisanti isn't a saint. He's just a guy. And for what it's worth, I actually quite enjoyed him. Alessandro Nivola's performance is probably the best part of the movie. To a greater extent, though, this is also true of all the figures in Tony's life. There's such a raw, ethereal feel to the flashbacks in the show because they're, again, sensationalized through Tony's memory, the most developmental and impressionistic influences that have stayed with him. To see them mundanely presented here doesn't ruin or contradict this emotion. It in fact forms a conclusion about impressionability and psychological influences that showcases how much can be done by something so insignificant, and how significant it can feel for a specific person. But the irony is that, in trying to subvert sensationalism, The Sopranos was still sensational. Its blend of cinematic ideas with TV is twofold. You have the heightened medium of the cinema mixed with the small-scale medium of TV, and the heightened world of organized crime people typically go to watch at the cinema, mixed with the down-to-earth, domestic family drama you typically tune into on TV. That was, of course, the explicit mission of the show, but all of this is to say that despite trying to ground us in the boring real world, the show still gave us an experience that was otherworldly and exciting. The goal was not to make something boring that would be interesting to watch by contrast because it's specifically subverting the expectation that the mob should be interesting. I don't even think that's the goal of The Many Saints either. Obviously they wanted to make a fun and exciting movie, but I guess it just gets a little lost in the sauce. A bland sauce whose lack of flavor subverts the seasoned expectation of Italian cuisine. Okay. Getting back on track. Maybe the issue is that it's a feature film, and this kind of blending only goes one way. That mundane episodes are better suited for TV. Maybe it has to do with runtime. There's an almost aimlessness to the show because of how gradually it progresses its longer arcs, and because of how sitcom-esque the individual episode plots are, because it has the space to do so. To complain that the movie doesn't have a discernible, linear plot momentum kind of misses the point. I think they were trying to operate within the same framework they used for the show, modified only slightly for the medium. It never set out to have a conventional narrative, so claiming failure on that front is a bit remiss. But if the point is that its vignettes and slice-of-life qualities don't work, you know what, I don't know why I'm framing this like you're making the point here. It's my point, and it's that none of the various threads are very interesting or introspective or fleshed out or coherent. And sure, life is messy, but again, the goal is grounded, but not bland. And so much of the movie is not just bland, but uncanny. The younger Sopranos roster, of course, feels like a bunch of guys doing impressions rather than embodying the role. Corey Stoll is the only convincing one here. John Bernthal and Vera Farmiga are also good, but they almost have too much star power for me to look past. I cannot stress enough, though, just how bad John Magaro is as Silvio. When he came on screen, I couldn't believe I was watching the real movie. I'm naturally reminded of the Soprano Diaries SNL sketch, but the funny thing about that is that The Sopranos pretty much already is a comedy, so I feel like some of what they were getting at in the sketch is what they were getting at with the movie. When Carmela shows up, we're supposed to think it's funny, as a sort of wink and a nod. Unfortunately, most of the other winks and nods fall into typical prequel pitfalls. So many lines and anecdotes alluded to in the show included here that don't contribute anything beyond audience recognition. Like other attempts at humor in the movie, it feels like low-hanging fruit. So many other lines also just feel like placeholder dialogue that's conveying information more than anything. After the time skip, Dickie asks Tony if he's seen Dirty Harry, and we get a little Dirty Harry quote. This gives us information about their relationship, and seems to try and recapture the ties to the movies present in the show. But when Silvio says,
"Just when they thought I was out, they pull me back in,"
it's not iconic because it just conveys the premise that these mob guys like mob movies and bond over it, which already has some irony. It's because the delivery and the circumstance of it are also funny. And this externalization, these idiosyncrasies, are where we get character from, which is why it's so nourishing from a character perspective that the show is chock full of moments like this. There's nothing memorable about this moment, and the David Chase of 20 years ago wouldn't allow for a throwaway line like that. More important than the gravitas of the individual lines, though, is the psychological gravitas. We see a lot of conflict in Dickie's life, and it kind of weighs on him, but not nearly to the degree some of it should. For instance, he's banging his stepmom and she goes,
"I like that word, motherfucker."
But aside from her occasionally teasing him with that line, there's no real sense of this Freudian element to the character. We only get one, kind of two domestic scenes in the family home with her where this could play out, but for the rest of the movie she's just his guma, which admittedly I didn't realize until making this video comes from godmother or second mother. I think that enhances the show more than the movie. But in any case, I'm pretty sure she's younger than him, so once the dad is out of the picture, so is any tangible psychosexuality. Maybe it wasn't intended to advertise psychological gravitas, but considering how interested the show is in the Oedipus complex, and how much more literally Dickie acts it out, I can't help but feel underwhelmed by how impalpable it ends up being. And I know to an extent I shouldn't be making such direct comparisons to the show with every criticism I have, but it's hard not to when the movie ends with a woke up this morning needle drop and Michael Imperioli saying, "And that's how Tony Soprano became Tony Soprano." The way they handled the narration was kinda cool. I like the idea of all these corpses talking from the afterlife and we're sort of sitting down with Christopher, but I also feel like to an extent that undercuts the very idea the show's Cut to Black was trying to convey about death. Not that it really matters, he narrates like 3 scenes in the whole movie. In his short time narrating though, he makes sure to tell us that Tony ends up killing him. In fact, he somehow works it into like every other sentence. When baby Christopher shows up in the movie then, there's this very clunky foreshadowing.
Some babies, when they come into the world, know all kinds of things from the other side.
And on one hand, if we didn't know from the narration that Tony ends up killing Christopher, we'd only have the show to go off of to know what exactly she's referring to, so I should admire the movie's attempt to be as self-contained as possible. But on the other hand, it feels so ham-fisted. So does the raven that Tony sees when Dickie kills his father. I know Christopher sees a raven in the show when he takes his oath, and it's a bad omen that ends up being true, but something about the raven being present here, with the baby prophesizing and Christopher narrating from beyond the grave, gives the movie a sense of fantasy beyond magic realism and omens. It's that sort of sensationalism I was talking about earlier, with none of the subversion or contradiction. That sort of thing is a tight line to toe, and I just don't think the movie lands it. And what does this moment really bring to the table? Or the Uncle Junior moment? I get the approach of the film. In a roundabout way, by being about Dickie, the movie is about how Tony got to the mindset that made him who he is in the show, and the varsity athlete thing and his relationship with Christopher are both important to that. But he really must not have had the makings of a varsity athlete because he's sidelined for most of the movie. Michael Gandolfini does a decent job after he joins the movie about an hour in, but he's given very little to work with. Which is a shame because his relationship with Dickie is the most interesting part of the story. I don't give a shit about Giuseppina's beauty parlor or the non-character Leslie Odom Jr. plays. The only reason the prison stuff worked is because of the hilarious reveal after Ray Liotta dies that he's actually playing a set of twins. When Dickie starts avoiding Tony, that's the first time the movie actually started to make me feel something, and then it ends about 10 minutes later. It was a good character beat to kill Dickie on, but it's kind of soiled by the reveal that Junior put out the hit. What are we supposed to get out of this? That mob guys are dubious? I mean, based on the approach, I don't think the movie's supposed to be about any one thing, just like the show isn't. But again, there's a narrower trajectory that the feature film medium is more inclined towards, and when you end the film on a beat and a line like,
"That's the guy, my Uncle Tony. The guy I went to hell for."
It's like, okay, maybe 20% of what I just watched had to do with that. The show, by not being about any one thing, in turn winds up being about everything, which is kind of specific in its own way. The movie is just about a couple things, which in turn feels like it's about nothing at all. So I guess it all just boils back down to the medium. The big screen makes the characters feel small by comparison, which is a useful tool in furthering the demystification the show started, but it brings too many issues with it for how much of the approach David Chase and company tried to carry over. If he had made this an isolated Newark riots movie with no ties to The Sopranos, as was the idea he eventually transfigured into this movie, and it were basically the same otherwise, it would probably wind up in the realm of Live by Night. Just a nothing burger of a mob movie that's boring and muddled instead of intricate and complex. Being connected to the most influential show of all time is the only thing that might keep it from being as passed over from the culture as Ben Affleck's movie. But without those ties, maybe Chase could have liberated himself from the approach that's bogging it down and wrote a movie better suited for the medium. As it stands, it's aimless in a way that doesn't service what it's trying to say about the life of the character, it falls victim to some classic prequel trappings, and worst of all, it's just a boring movie. It certainly doesn't tarnish the reputation of the show or anything. The show is still great, and always will be, and the only thing kind of retconned is the cause of Dickie's death, but it's not like we ever know in the show how he actually died anyway. At the very least, the characters still don't, so it's not a big deal. If you had a great time with The Many Saints of Newark, then I'm envious and wish you all the best rewatching it in the future. And who knows, maybe there's actually some big brain work at play here I'm just not picking up on, and in a few years I'll think it's brilliant. People have generally come around on the show's ending from what I understand. I watched it like a year ago, so I have no idea how I would have felt watching it when it aired. I was like 7 though. Anyway, until that day comes, you can find links to my social media and Patreon in the description. In fact, I just started a new Patreon perk. For just $5 a month, you can crack open a cold one and share a drink with me as I discuss with friends what I've watched at the end of a given month. Our second happy hour will be up at the end of October, but for now, you can catch up and see what we watched in September. That's about it from me, but thanks for watching, and have a nice day.